Hello and welcome to the Alliance for Finance Neurodiversity seminar event. I'm Anya, the chair of the Alliance for Finance, and thank you all for attending this morning. We have a great turnout today and some fantastic speakers and topic to present you all with. It's a privilege to welcome you to this important seminar on supporting neurodiversity in the workplace. Our goal today is to explore how we can create more inclusive, supportive and empowering environments for all employees, particularly those who are neurodivergent. Neurodiversity refers to the natural variants in the human brain that affect how we think, learn and interact with the world. This includes conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia and dyspraxia, among others. This means many of our colleagues, friends and family members experience the world in unique and valuable ways. Embracing neurodiversity in the workplace is not just a matter of fairness or compliance, it is a strategic advantage. Neurodivergent individuals often bring exceptional strengths to their roles, such as creativity, problem-solving skills, attention to detail, and innovative thinking. By fostering an inclusive environment, we unlock these talents and drive our organisations towards greater success. However, traditional workplace practices can sometimes pose challenges for neurodivergent employees. It is our responsibility as leaders, colleagues and allies to recognise these challenges and take proactive steps to address them. This includes providing reasonable accommodations, promoting flexible working arrangements, and fostering a culture of understanding and respect. Today, we will hear from experts in the field, share best practices, and engage in meaningful discussions about how we can support neurodivergent individuals in our workplaces. I encourage you all to participate actively, ask questions and share your experiences. Together, we can create workplaces where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. We welcome any questions through our chat function. We may not be able to get through all of them, but we'll certainly try. We do have, unfortunately, an apology from one of the speakers that was due to speak this morning, and that's due to some personal circumstances, unfortunately, that have happened today. But I'd like to introduce the speakers that we've got today, and I'll let them give a brief introduction as to what they will be covering today at the start of their presentations. So today we have first to speak Gary Grange, a social impact expert and neurodiversity advocate. Then we will have Janine Booth joining us from Reading the Spectrum. Janine is a trade unionist and will discuss why it's so important for us to be raising awareness in the workplace. Janine will also discuss a neurodiversity course she's putting on through the GFTU next year. And our third and final speaker today is Kelly Given, who will cover autism and her lived experience and the work she's involved in. So I'd like now to kick off the seminar and to welcome and hand over to Gary.
Thank you, Anya, and hi everyone. Thank you for attending. For me, this is a really important area of diversity and inclusion. It's an invisible area of diversity, which is maybe why it seems to lag behind in many ways all other areas of diversity in terms of progress that's been made, although touch wood, lots of progress is now being made by many. Just in terms of background about myself, as Anya said, I'm a sort of social impact expert and neurodiversity advocate. But if I rewind to give you some idea of why I suppose I'm sitting before you today, around 6 years ago, I was working as head of community investment for Royal Mail Group in a senior role. I knew at that time, I knew very little about neurodiversity. In fact, probably next to nothing, if I'm being totally honest. But at the same time, my son was getting in a lot of trouble at school. He had severe depression, severe anxiety, and was starting to have more and more suicidal thoughts. The professionals told me and my wife that there was nothing wrong with him, and he was just a naughty kid going through a phase, and that it would all sort itself out. But I think as a parent, you know when something just isn't right, certainly with your own children and loved ones. Things gradually got worse over a year or two. He was having extreme meltdowns, was extremely impulsive, extreme mood swings, seemed not to recognize risk or be able to control his thoughts, emotions, or actions. He was, in a space of 12 months, excluded from 2 schools, sent to a pupil referral unit, and was getting in trouble with the police at the same time. And bear in mind, apart from holding down a senior manager's role at this point, I was also a magistrate. So it was a struggle for me to constantly be told that basically there was nothing wrong with my son and he was just a bad parent. Eventually we went private, and he was diagnosed with, and sorry, I would say we were fortunate enough to be able to go private, because the waiting list was around 3 years for a formal diagnosis at that point. But he was diagnosed with ADHD and dyspraxia. And I think from that day, he started to receive proper support. The school, although not brilliant, and I actually do defend pupil referral units. They get an extremely bad name, but they were really supportive of him, understood his condition, which a lot of people in the mainstream schools didn't understand. He started to put in place methods to learn to control his emotions and behaviours, and was, more importantly, able to understand more about himself and why he'd been how he'd been for many years. Fast forward to now, he's thrived. He's an international public speaker now. He's a neurodiversity advocate himself. He was a finalist at last year's National Diversity Awards, and all this for a person who was told and written off by society and told he would end up in prison. So it just goes to show that the start of the journey is a diagnosis, and that's really important. While all of this was unfolding, I recognised in myself, and because I'd educated myself a lot around the area of neurodiversity during these years, and I knew neurodiverse conditions often run in the family, I started to recognise that I myself had ADHD, and received a diagnosis, and this also helped me put my life into perspective. But more, it made me want to help other people, because I knew what an horrendous time me, my son, my family had been through. And when I say horrendous, I could have lost my son, I could have lost my marriage, and I could have lost my own sanity. And there's people going through that now every day, whether it be in school, in the family network, in the workplace, in the justice system. So that's a very brief rundown of my background and why I'm sitting before you today. So basically, what is neurodiversity? And Anya touched on it, but I mean, we could talk about what neurodiversity is all day, but in its purest form, neurodiversity is an essential form of human diversity. The idea that one brain is normal and healthy is sort of no more right than or valid than believing that there is only one right or normal gender, race, or culture. I mean, it's ridiculous, and we have to embrace difference. As Anya touched on again, neurodiversity includes things like ADHD, people with autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, which is one that doesn't get mentioned too often, dyspraxia, and even Tourette syndrome falls under that. And ultimately, neurodiversity is just a concept that all human brains vary in terms of neurocognitive ability. Everyone has talents and things that they struggle with, but I think when for those that are neurodiverse, the struggles and the strengths can be at the extreme ends. And I think from a workplace perspective, it's important to recognise that and understand that. In terms of statistics, which I also think are very important, around 20% of people are considered to be neurodiverse, so have one of those conditions. Broken down, around 1 in 10 are thought to be dyslexic. 1 in 12 are thought to have ADHD. Around 10% are thought to have dyspraxia, and around 6% of the population have dyscalculia. And I'll come on to in a bit more detail about what those conditions are. Some really upsetting statistics for me as well are the fact that around 7 in 10 children that get excluded from school are neurodiverse. And I think if that was any other area of diversity, there'd be a national outcry. But for some reason, it seems acceptable to society that 7 in 10 children excluded are neurodiverse, and very little is done about it. Neurodiverse people also are much more likely to be unemployed. And just, for instance, just 21% of autistic people are in employment. And that's from the Office of National Statistics. But when they're the type of statistics you often see and hear about in the media, but I don't apologise for mentioning them. I mean, I do get annoyed that all we ever hear about neurodiversity is negative statistics and negative stories. But I can offset that with a statistic such as 40% of business owners and entrepreneurs are neurodiverse. So it seems strange that maybe the education system is missing the talents and abilities of amazing individuals. So from a workplace perspective, there's lots of neurodiverse conditions, and I believe there's lots of business benefits to employing and supporting neurodiverse talent. And I'll quickly run through them. So you've got ADHD, as I said, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That name, by the way, annoys me in itself, because you can just see the negativity around it. You know, in one condition, we mentioned deficit and disorder. And although it can be seen in that way, the focus doesn't need to be that direct. How can it impact on an individual? It can be things like, and I'll only run through a couple because again, I could go on forever. Things like inattentiveness, impulsiveness, hyperactivity. But on the positive side, people with ADHD are often very visually enthusiastic. They're extremely creative. Their perseverance is on a different level. They work well under pressure, and they have intense energy and enthusiasm. So I think as a business and as a union, we have to understand that if we can either focus on the negatives or we can focus on the positives. And I would always focus on strengths rather than weaknesses. Then we have autism. Again, it's a condition that affects people in many ways. It can sort of affect their non-typical traits and behaviours. But people with autism have intense hyper-focus. Their observational skills are absolutely superb. Again, they're very creative. They're very analytical, which is why a lot of the tech industries and the finance industries tend to employ a lot of autistic people. Again, going back to ADHD, the creative industries are awash with people with ADHD because they think outside the box. We've got conditions such as dyscalculia, again, not as often heard of as dyslexia, but simply I would say it's almost dyslexia, but with numbers and arithmetic. People with dyscalculia can lack an intuitive grasp of numbers and can have problems learning numbers. But by the same rule, they're extremely good at problem solving and they have amazing practical abilities. Again, with things like dyspraxia, it can affect coordination, both physical and mental, which can create problems in the workplace, as you can imagine. But again, they are good holistic thinkers. They're very creative and I have high levels of literacy. So just very quickly, that just gives you an indication of why businesses should focus on strengths, should employ neurodiverse people and support neurodiverse people, because if they're properly supported, they will undoubtedly thrive and be incredibly beneficial for businesses. And from a business perspective, I would always say, don't think about your employees, think about your customers. And if you care about your customers and you want services and products that reflect your customers, then you need neurodiverse people to work in your business to reflect your customers and the products and services that you're going to develop and create. Another area that isn't often talked about is coexisting conditions with neurodiversity, and it's not something that's often considered. But I think very often young people, or older people, they get a diagnosis of something like ADHD or autism, and they walk away and think, right, that's the end of the story. But it's not, because for instance, someone with ADHD, probably around 30 to 50% of people with ADHD are thought to be on the autism spectrum disorder. People with dyslexia, around 20 to 40% of those are believed to have dyscalculia. So I think it's very important to take a really holistic approach with neurodiversity and understand that you shouldn't just focus on one condition. I know a lot of local authorities and businesses do a lot around autism, which is fantastic. But just by tackling autism, you're not going to tackle the root cause in many circumstances. So, I mean, to wrap up, how can businesses be more neurodiversity inclusive? I think, first of all, we ensure that you have HR and employment policies to recruit and support those who are neurodiverse. I mean, that's obvious, or you would assume it's obvious, but I think I see a recent stat that only 30% of businesses actually do this still, which seems incredible. I look upon neurodiversity as being on a very similar trajectory as mental health was sort of 10 years ago. And I think, I was in a position that helped sort of hopefully change that dramatically at Royal Mail Group and Post Office Limited. And I think it all starts with talking about something and educating people about something. And I think with neurodiversity, we need to start, businesses, unions need to start talking about it more, providing people with more information, and actually having positive role models and celebrate neurodiversity as we do with race, gender, and sexuality. And I think we need to consider people's differences and how businesses can support this and help them to thrive in the workplace. We hear the term workplace adjustments all of the time, and I don't think that's workplace adjustments are not just for neurodiverse people. So let's not allow people to single out neurodiverse people in assuming they're the only ones that require workplace adjustments, because that's not true. Workplace adjustments are incredibly important. And they will benefit not just neurodiverse people, but all of your employees. And I think the main thing for me is to remember that difference is strength, and businesses should make sure that they talk about this. Difference in all forms brings incredible strength. And I was speaking to someone the other day that was telling me that they'd seen a statistic that most businesses that fail because, or one of the reasons is certainly because the founder or CEO stroke owner surrounds themselves with similar people and people that think the same. And I think that just shows, if most businesses are failing when the CEO or owner surrounds themselves with like-minded people, it shows that we must ensure that we've got people that think differently within all businesses. So that's just really, I hope it was helpful. I have rushed through it really quickly because it's a very complex area. But more than happy to answer any questions when the time arises.
Thank you very much for that, Gary. That's really been interesting and useful. And thank you also as well for sharing your own personal experience, because that's also important for people to understand that this is what does happen. I know that I've got some personal family experience in terms of children and the expulsion from school, and they're not understanding that there is there as well. So that's much appreciated that you've shared that experience as well with everybody. I'm just going to ask Caroline and Fiona if there are any questions at all that have come through from that. And also just to remind everybody, if they do have questions, just put them in the chat, and we can either do that now after each presentation, or we can save it till the end. Is there anything in there?
Nothing specifically that's come through question-wise. I did put a comment in the chat just saying, from a union perspective, we've been talking to some of our partnered organisations about mapping areas within branches to make them easily accessible for people who are neurodiverse, but they don't have to actively go out and ask someone for a quieter space, but that there's areas that are either quieter or areas that might have a bit more space around them, particularly in terms of sort of smells and noises that might be around them, and also going through and talking to organisations that have private healthcare and trying to ensure that they are including neurodiverse diagnoses in part of that, because there are an awful lot of people there are long time scales for children, but also adults who are later life being diagnosed, who might be going through difficulties at work, that just some understanding and knowledge of the diagnosis that they may have will help with reasonable adjustments, with managers understanding, with themselves understanding why they might think slightly differently. Excuse me. So having that ability to access that, if they've got private healthcare, as one of the elements that healthcare offers, will help with that reduction in waiting lists that, as you say, Gary, can be anything from 18 months up to 4 years in different regions now.
Perfect. Thanks, Caroline. Do we have Janine on the call as our next speaker? And if not, whilst we try and contact Janine, Kelly, would you be okay to speak next?
Sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute. That's me. Yeah, that's not a problem at all. Hiya. Thank you for having me. I want to talk a little bit about my own experience today. Autism researcher Jack Denhousing said that everything that we know about the Earth is based on the fundamental understanding that the Earth is round, but that there was a time not that long ago that everyone knew that the Earth was flat. A paradigm shift took place. Our basic assumptions about the Earth changed because the evidence showed that our previous assumptions were wrong. There are assumptions about neurodivergence in the same way, and the tide is really changing in a similar fashion. Most of us understand neurodivergence through a medical lens because that's how we've been taught to view it. We're taught that it's a medical ailment like any other that needs treatment and often pity. The trouble is, it's not that at all. It's a difference that needs accommodated, not an illness that needs treated for the comfort of everyone else. When we medicalise a neurodevelopmental difference, we so often miss the opportunity to recognise the human being that we're setting out to help. This shows up more problematically than almost any other area of life in the workplace. For context, I am autistic and ADHD, and I wasn't diagnosed until I was 24, which meant that for the first 6 years of my full-time working life, I was without the tools that I needed to succeed. And that wasn't necessarily just because I was undiagnosed, but because the corporate environment was such an impossible space for me to exist as a neurodivergent person, whether I was diagnosed or not. In that space, it's often expected that we perform our disability if we're able to get access to the reasonable adjustments that really are the be-all and end-all of our ability to succeed. We usually have to supply a formal diagnosis to justify the help that we need, and bureaucracy takes priority over human understanding. which legally is problematic because under the Equality Act, a disabled person doesn't have to have a diagnosis in order to access support. Yet this element of proof in the corporate world seems to have become a well-integrated barrier for the neurodivergent population. I want to talk about my own experience because I think it's a perfect example of what reasonable adjustments can do and what it means for a neurodivergent person who doesn't have any. And I'm going to start with my worst. I started this job bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as a 21-year-old who had been working and volunteering in politics and human rights from the age of 16. I'd somehow managed to land my dream job, working in human rights for a leading organisation, and I couldn't have been more excited about it. I had huge ambitions and couldn't wait to progress and show them what I could do. I tried so hard and was often found in the office long after everyone else had gone home in a sort of misguided attempt at overcompensating. But it didn't matter how excited I was or how determined I was to succeed, because I was never going to, and it wasn't within my control. The office itself was a sensory nightmare, open plan to the extreme, as are most modern corporate environments, with a kitchen where everyone made their lunch just around the corner, meaning that all day at work I was subjected to other people's phone calls, incessant typing, mouses clicking, the kind of fluorescent overhead lighting we've all unfortunately become accustomed to in the corporate space. Just by walking into that office, I was on the back foot in comparison to everyone else because my brain struggled to process everything around it. I tried to wear headphones when I worked to mask the noise, but I was told it was unhelpful because people couldn't get my attention from across the room, and so I was told to take them off. So I would sit there for 8 hours every day with a clenched jaw and forced myself to endure it. When I really couldn't cope, I closed myself in what was supposed to be a modern addition to the office, the quiet pod, a tiny rectangular prison situated at the end of the office, which gave me some reprieve from the noise, but that meant I was isolated from everyone in my team, and that soon showed. I'll never forget the hours that I spent locked in that pod. I could feel the judgment seeping through the glass walls, and the isolation was crippling both professionally and socially. It quickly became unsustainable, and I became unwell in every sense of the word. When I tried to access reasonable adjustments, I was told no. Eventually, I was told they didn't agree that I was autistic, and in their opinion, I was just anxious. I was eventually fired after 18 months without ever having a single reasonable adjustment in place. It ruined me in pretty much every sense of the word. Financially, I had taken on a home in Edinburgh city centre so that I could be there for this job. I lost that home, and the trauma of the experience stopped me from leaving the house for months. It left me so lost and without hope that I was actively suicidal, and it took years of therapy to overcome. The trauma of that experience still follows me at work today when I find myself over-explaining, when my boss asks me for a chat, and the panic attack that ensues when I'm constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop and the termination letter to arrive. And it was years ago. Luckily for me, after finding my feet after that job, I accepted a job with the NHS. I almost never went, so consumed by the trauma of what had happened before, but I did. And on that first day, my manager took me into a room and she said, "What do you need? Whatever you need, you can have." I never once had to perform a disability for her. I never once had to put her in touch with my psychiatrist. I never had to divulge every intimate detail of my medical history. I never had to sit in a mind-numbing meeting with a HR representative. She just believed me and gave me whatever I needed. And because of that, I excelled. I was promoted for the first time in my life. I became the chair of the NHS Disabled Employee Network, and I went on to win multiple awards at work. And it showed me that I wasn't the problem in the first job. It wasn't entirely my fault. And that actually, when I had the support in place that I needed, I could thrive just like everybody else. I think we get caught up in the bureaucracy and the tick box exercises that the corporate function requires of us when we're talking about reasonable adjustments. And we lose the human understanding that should be front and centre of our approach. Less than 20% of diagnosed autistic people in the UK are in paid work, despite over 80% of us wanting to or being able to work. That's not a problem for autistic people, that's a problem for the workplace. Your neurodivergent colleagues, employees, friends are not lazy or unreliable. They're not a nightmare or a problem to be solved. They think differently, they work differently, they probably communicate differently, and that's okay. There should be space for all of us. So I want you to think about the fact that we used to feel like the earth was flat and how our opinions on that changed as the evidence changed, and apply that same thinking to your neurodivergent colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Kelly. And again, you know, it's thank you ever so much for sharing your personal experience with us all. Do we have any questions at all?
There's one from Nick Keaton. Sorry, there's a terrible echo. I wonder if employers are using the most of government grants, such as access to work, or even know about how to access this.
That's a good point. No, they're definitely not. And I don't think they're actually doing enough to promote it to their colleagues either. I mean, I didn't even know about access to work until my most recent job, and I only started this job last year. I've been diagnosed now for almost 4 or 5 years, and this is the first of me hearing about it. So they're definitely not. There are also difficulties with access to work and how it's set up. Access to work basically requires the individual to apply, but everything is through the employer. So the employer will own all the equipment that's bought, the employer is responsible for ordering all the equipment, and that presents a barrier because, and it's a barrier that I faced actually, because we then get lost in the bureaucracy again of the HR process and how that works. So instead of actually being given a grant, you are given an amount that you can spend, and it's on your employer to spend it up front, and they'll then be reimbursed. And notoriously, employers do not love to spend money, so it becomes really challenging actually to even access that work. And that's probably a point for the government, and that needs to be it needs to be looked at again, and it needs to be reformed, I think, for it to actually be worth its while. But as it stands right now, it's not fit for purpose, and employers are purposefully not doing enough towards it because it costs them money in the interim. It's also heavy on the bureaucracy and takes up a lot of time and energy, so it takes a lot of resource, and we're still not there yet. But access to work is a really good, if you can get through the barriers, it's a really good system, and it really does help. So if you have neurodivergent employees, I would definitely advise you to tell them about it and to let them apply for it and to do what you can to facilitate that.
Is there a link that we could share amongst the Q&A page, because the chat functionality is not working on this today, for that, and then people can access that if that's okay?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kelly. Any other questions at all?
Yes, I've just seen one in the chat. Someone's put, if you met your original employer again now, what tips would you give them to deal with things differently? And is there something you'd like to say to your past self?
I think the main thing that I would tell my past employer is just to be more human. I think what was sorely missing in that experience was just a human element of compassion and understanding. I was treated like a cog in the machine rather than a human being, and I was looked at very much through my productivity and how I could integrate into the corporate environment rather than what I could bring as an individual. And if I just had a little bit of compassion, a little bit of understanding, even a little bit of willingness, there was none of that. My experience could have been completely different. I mean, I look at my next experience at the NHS and how amazing that experience was. And it was solely down to that one manager having a human experience with her and having some compassion from her. So I think that's what the advice that I would give them. I think in terms of reasonable adjustments for autistic people and neurodivergent people, flexibility is often the biggest thing that we need. It tends to look different for every single one of us, and it can be difficult to integrate reasonable adjustments in the workplace in a way that works. Sometimes our needs fluctuate from hour to hour, sometimes they fluctuate from day to day. And so a solid, rigid plan of reasonable adjustments doesn't always work. So I think I would always just advise to be human about it. Forget about the corporate function, free yourself from the corporate expectation, and just speak to your colleagues and your staff members as the people that they are, and believe them when they tell you. I mean, no autistic person is coming into the workplace and performing their disability for you. They're not putting it on, they're not pretending to have these difficulties. Believe me, if we could come into the workplace and function the same way as everybody else and fit in seamlessly, we would do that. Nobody is lying about it or putting it on in order to access reasonable adjustments. I think that's a key thing. So yeah, I would just advise them to be human about it and to look at the person sitting in front of you rather than the corporate cog. In terms of myself, I think I would advise myself to just be kinder to myself and to let myself breathe. I think I put so much expectation on myself and I blamed myself so much for all the things that went wrong, and I really took a hit on multiple occasions. This wasn't the only time I had a bad experience. This is the worst of the worst. But there were other times in the run up to that I also had bad experiences, and it becomes a sort of internalized thing where you believe that you are the problem. And if you're told that you're the problem over and over again, you will start to believe it. And it takes a long time to unpack that and to feel better about it. So I think I would just, when I look back on myself then and what I was going through and the mental state that I was in, I just feel so sad for myself, and I feel so sad for that young girl who just wanted to do well and was so ambitious and wanted so badly to be accepted. And I would just offer her the compassion that I didn't offer her at the time, and that nobody else offered her either. So I think, yeah, I would just be much kinder to myself.